All right. So if you don't mind, I'll use the board and just use the slides to project some videos that could be useful to see. And so I realized that I did what the previous speaker said we shouldn't do, to start with the model and go straight to the point. So maybe what I'll do is I'll say just for a couple of minutes something about the motivation that inspired us. And if you find this impressionistic remark at the beginning annoying, please be reassured that there will be models be written down, modification of Hopfield models that instantiate everything that I'm saying, followed by analytical calculations, not devoid of technical interest, in my opinion, simulations that back them up, and implementation with neuromorphic chips are the ideas that I'm trying to illustrate. So first of all, I'd like to say probably what we mean by computation in this talk. So in this talk, we'll take the view that computation, at its essence, maybe in its simplest form, is the controlled evolution of a state. Even the most primitive algorithm, something sequential, will probably involve going through a sequence of commands in the right order, because it could be arbitrarily more complicated. It could be branching and things like that. But I think you probably want at least to have a sequence of things going in the right order. Okay. Now, if you think about computation being the controlled evolution of a state, then a natural question arises that gives rise to the term asynchronous computation, which is, how do different parts? So as I was saying, if we view computation as the controlled evolution of a state, the state could be, for example, the state of a bunch of neurons or spins, then one question is, how different parts of this state update in time as this computation unfolds? And asynchronous computation is predicated on the fact that in a dream world, different parts of this physical state update in time or evolve in time independently from the others, without blocks, without the central control, without a central clock. Now, this computer, this phone do not work with the principle of asynchronous computation. That doesn't mean that isn't a sought after thing from a perspective of engineering, because if you could really only trigger computations where and when it is needed, then you could save energy. So there's a lot of industrial research that will not be very well represented by my talk on asynchronous computation by researchers at IBM and in other places. I would also like to point out that asynchronous computation presents some difficulties that you can probably imagine that are connected to this discussion of spin glasses and chaos that we had yesterday. If different parts of this physical state update independently, and this thing is supposed to do the correct sequence of commands, how do we know that it doesn't go out of order and devolves into a total chaos and mess? Well, the answer is it does typically devolve into chaos and mess, and there are theorems that prove it in certain specific contexts. And so one of the things that people have been wondering is, well, in nature, there seems to be systems that perform things, what often we call emergent computational abilities without a central clock. So how do they do it? Can we get inspiration from that? And one of them is the brain. There's been the chief source of inspiration from a field called also neuromorphic computing. And so what today's talk is an attempt to introduce simple models amenable to analytical treatment of asynchronous computation, or asynchronous sequence recall, if you want more precisely, and to show some tricks that we came up with to make sure that we can still do sequential memory retrieval more properly, or asynchronous computation. And I want to show you how we do that.
Can I just ask, I mean, if you have algorithms where it's a very synchronous, but then every now and again, everyone pauses to wait for everyone else to catch up, does that count as synchronous?
Yeah, so one of the ways that people have tried to fix this problem is to just engineer buffers, memory delays, to orchestrate something. So in a sense, yes, but the game here is to do it in a way that is as economical as possible.
Okay. So
the absolute dream would be if the same neurons that are doing the computation have a delay that emerges. And that is the thing that I want to show you without you baking the structure. And that's our dream, and you can assess.
Rather than global.
Yeah, and emergent also. And you can see to what extent we're going to be delivering, maybe a little bit. Okay, this is also work in progress, which means that I'm still digesting it. So if you ask questions, I will learn a lot, and please do. And this talk has a modular structure, but I think we're going to go through only the first part anyway. Okay, so now let me do my real beginning, which is to start with the model. So first of all, I think that I'm going to start with the vanilla Hopfield model. Luca Mazzucato yesterday gave an introduction, so I probably don't have to explain it if you have never seen it. Also, there are experts in the field here. But I'm going to try to write down the key equations and maybe start setting the terminology. Okay, so we're imagining that we have a bunch of neurons represented by the variable I, and there will be a time update. So this is a discrete time update. And the state of the neuron I at time t plus delta t is related to the sign of this expression that is very reminiscent of what this is a discrete form of what you would probably get in an Ising model, okay, with an exchange Jij. Xj of t is the state of the neuron J. So this is the exchange interaction. And then you put some noise on this variable x. And as you heard yesterday from Luca, the whole gist about the Hopfield model is for memory retrieval or associative memory, is how you choose these Jijs. Okay.
You don't stop that.
Yeah, I noticed that I'm making an implicit, repeated index are summed if they are the italic one. I'm sorry, I should have said. And now, let's say that we have a bunch of patterns. These patterns, maybe it's bad practice, hopefully you can get them in. Let's say that there are n patterns that we want to retrieve. Maybe there are digits. And what we're going to define is this Jij to be, and here I'm going to write the sum because otherwise it's a bit confusing, the sum over this pattern from 1 to n of squibble I, squibble j mu. This describes the patterns. And when you have this setup and you run this dynamics, what you can see, and maybe this is something that I can show you here if you want to, if you've never seen it before in your life. Please forget about synchronous and asynchronous. We start with this pattern that is clearly, I don't know what I'm going to call it, disordered. And then as you run this dynamics, you can retrieve one of these patterns. These are not digits, but they're letters, which is the Z. Okay? And one thing that I want to also define for later reference, you can define an overlap, which is, if you like, an order parameter to be the overlap, the dot product, okay, of the state of your neuron with the pattern in question. Here again, summation over the I implied.
Can I just, just to make clear, so even though you've drawn this as 2 dimensions, there's no actual structure, right? The Jij, everything's coupled everything else.
Yeah,
there's no locality.
And of course, if I get ever to the second or the third part of the talk, when we try to implement this in physical systems, then you got to confront this issue, and they're quite interesting. But already, I want to draw a terminological thing here that I think is important for this talk. The synchronous versus asynchronous. So what we'll mean here in this talk, asynchronous, is that we update the neurons, not all in one go, but one at a time in random order. Okay? Now, one of the things that you will see, and this is the reason why I call this vanilla Hopfield, is that the dynamics of that model, I forgot to make a remark that is perhaps evident. This definition implies that Jij is symmetric, right? I can flip I with J. So implicit in here is this fact, or explicit is this fact, okay?
Is big N the number of neurons or the number of patterns?
Patterns.
Even in the definition of M?
Huh? Oh, I see. I think I've used the different, in this one, it's so how about I do this to keep it a little bit, there may be this little inconsistency propagated.
He made a local letter.
Yeah, look, so that's fair. I mean, this talk is a bit asynchronous too, given the time at which it was prepared yesterday. Okay, while nursing a toddler. So so you guys can see that when Gij is symmetric, the dynamics is relaxational. In other words, this is an equilibrium model that will go to a minimum on an energy. Okay. Because of that reason, whether you are updating synchronously or asynchronously doesn't really matter. I mean, you saw that movie. I can just play it again. The synchronous is on the left, the asynchronous is on the right. There isn't really any difference significant. You don't expect to be any difference because it's as if you were doing magnetism. You have what they're called, Glauber and the other one, model for the dynamics. If you're concentrating on equilibrium property, this distinction is not so important. Okay? Now, as you heard at the beginning, we said that our computation has to be at least a sequence of steps that we want to do in the right order. So obviously, we cannot stop at this. We have to do something a bit different. And the natural thing that people have done for years, and you heard yesterday also for Luca, is to say, how about we replace this Jij by Kij, let's say, that is defined in very much the analogous manner. There's probably factor 1 over n floating. Maybe there's one over here too, but okay, let's sprinkle them as needed. But the crucial thing that I want to emphasize is that how about we create a projector, something like that, where we have the mu plus 1 pattern and the mu pattern. So for example, here, mu could be H and mu plus 1 could be whatever this letter is, O. Okay? Well, now, the first thing that you can see is that this Kij is no longer symmetric, right? Evidently. And I like it to write this almost like a projector. Huh? Mu plus 1, I don't know if this is having done too much quantum mechanics. So you take the mu plus 1, mu, and you take it onto, and you project it onto mu plus 1. Why is that a game changer? Well, let's do an experiment.
Vincenzo, can I ask, are you assuming these are orthogonal? You have to put inverse matrix in if they're not.
So the question is this question of the independence of the patterns and the orthogonality, how much overlap this pattern has.
Because
in the vanilla version of Hopfield, it's actually quite useful to us to, if not necessary, to assume this orthogonality. I'm going to introduce momentarily something called modern Hopfield that allows to be less concerned about that pattern.
you can also just do what, like Amit already, if you do the projection method, right, you also solve it even in this thing.
Yeah. So I'm going to do a more primitive experiment. Okay. So imagine that, and you can see that I'm a theorist, but so this is my experiment. Okay. So these are two spins. Okay. But they have asymmetric, anti-symmetric, in fact, exchange. Spin red wants to align with speed green, and speed green wants to anti-align. For some of us, this is almost like a portrait of our sentimental lives, portrait of our lives. But let's see what happens. Okay, so red wants to anti-align, does that. Green wants to align, does that. Red continues. So, they chase each other in this sort of eternal frustration, right? And it could be a good thing if you like change. But the point is that non-reciprocity, as it's sometimes called, I mean, maybe the analogy is particularly telling in that sense, this asymmetry promotes cycles. So even if you did a vanilla Ising model with asymmetric interaction, the question would no longer be how thermal fluctuation or noise destroy order, but how the oscillations of each of these components triggered by this asymmetric couplet survives noise when you couple many such components. Okay?
If you start coupling many, don't you lose the cycles and it becomes chaos?
And not necessarily. Even the Ising model, the non-reciprocal Ising model, we wrote papers very recently, even on the vanilla, without disorder, without nothing, there are bifurcations between the system behaving as a global clock versus, and you're going to see it in today's talk, analyzed in detail in the context of learning. Okay? And I should say that Julia Garcia Lorenzana, with a subset of these collaborators, wrote an interesting paper called Non-Reciprocal. I shouldn't say interesting because I'm also an author, but I mean, it's mostly her. So, non-reciprocal spin glass transition, where she tackles the same problem and aging in the context of spin glasses. I'll do it in the context of Hopfield. Okay, so this is not a new idea. This is not our idea. It's an idea as old as the at least Hopfield, if not more. And I want to show you how Hopfield actually, in his own writing, talk about the need. I mean, the fact that the asymmetry is interesting is because if you do neuroscience, for example, there's inhibitory and excitatory neurons. So the only reason for making symmetric is to make your life easy mathematically. If you want to use, for example, all the machinery or replica, etc., of course, you can force nature to be whatever you want. This is quite realistic in a variety of cases. But the asynchrony also is quite generic. And here is how Hopfield describes it. And here I couldn't resist to just get this paper. This is not a Hopfield, this is maybe a less famous paper than the one that was quoted by Nobel, but it uses this beautiful anthropomorphic language. Asynchronously was deliberately introduced to represent a combination of propagation delays, jitter, noise in real neural systems. What he's saying is that whenever you think, as Hopfield did, as emergent computational ability, not only neural networks as algorithm, but also in physical systems that embed it, none of these things will be naturally synchronized. And then he says, it proves to be much more difficult to persuade a collection of neurons to move from one state to another. Okay? And what does that mean? Well, what that means, let's go back to that simulation. You can just simulate the whole thing again. Notice that here in this simulation, maybe I played it too fast, the synchronous algorithm on the left goes through the sequence without any problem. But let me just replace it because I didn't time it theatrically in the proper way. On the left, there's the synchronous one. Below, there are the overlap. On the right, there's the asynchronous one. I would say that the asynchronous one, you will see that it stays in this, I don't know, let's call it blackout state. Pretty much all the time, whereas the other one cycles through this sequence. Okay. Now, this should not shock you that you can actually have this problem if you're doing a non-equilibrium thing.
Vincenzo, I don't think that's okay. When we do this, because we've done it so many times for the last 15 years, if you put an inverse matrix in there, the asynchronous works very similar to the synchronous. It's because they're non-orthogonal. That's my feeling.
Yeah. Okay, but I don't think that changes significantly the problem.
I think if you just do this asynchronous dynamics, having put in,
it's because the overlap. It's because you put more noise.
Yeah.
You reduce noise and stuff. That your basic point is right, but here you have many ways.
And one other thing that I didn't say, and it's also related, is that one way that you could try to also run this is on a variant of Hopfield called modern Hopfield, in which this Jij that I showed on the blackboard is replaced by a nonlinear function of the overlap times squibble. Please notice what is being done here. If this function is linear, then this expression is exactly that. But if this function, for example, was a polynomial of order n, you're tossing in some nonlinearity. This is something that happens to increase the performance of the Hopfield model. This is what was done also in some of the simulations. And that by itself does not yet cure your problem. It cures other things that I'm going to say related to the correlation between the successive pattern, but not yet.
Dynamics that you do, you flip spins at random. But what happens if you do it like in a
very good
way? Like I don't know, I flip just the most unstable ones and not the stable ones, and
so the only thing we haven't done this specifically, but what I can tell you is that how exactly you do matters. For example, whether you need to use the modern Hopfield or not depends on whether, for example, let's say I take one spin randomly, then I have a choice. Do I put it back in the pool from which I can pick up the next? Or do I exclude it because it's been chosen already? Now, you can see, that's why I mentioned this example. If I exclude it, I'm now building some form of correlation in the succession of patterns, and that typically will require a modern Hopfield to deal with.
I mean,
but can't you just exclude it for some time?
And probably if you exclude it just for some time, there would be a correlation time. And so you would have to, I don't think that you exclude you don't solve it. But with the modern Hopfield, you can deal with this issue. So
the reason why I'm asking is that, I mean, if you try to flip, so you would like to flip spins that don't destabilize all the others, so that basically the dynamics is regular. So either you do as, I guess.
The only thing, Francesco, is that what we are imagining in a dream world, it's implemented this thing, or even physical system that implement this thing spontaneously. So the easier we can make our life, and so that, I don't know, we can convince or persuade a set of physical or biological degree of freedom to do it, that would be our dream. So we went for limiting as much as possible. And that's why we don't find all the Sompolinsky solution that involve buffer, etc., because then you have to engineer them. Okay, so you'll see momentarily building these things. And okay,
just to clarify,
please.
So when you say random order, you mean you pick one at random and you
Yeah,
update?
let's say that I have a grid or a list. I just pick up any of them with equal probability.
So you don't enforce that you go through every one before you take the, you could also do an update where you do it in random order, but you enforce that you don't update.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that how you do that matters. For example, if I pick up 7, okay, then at the next delta t, am I allowed to pick up 7 again, or do I say something like what you're saying? Since you've been picked up already, you got to wait for your turn. If I say you got to wait for your turn, then I'm building correlations. Yeah. And so this algorithm does just as well with that, provided, the algorithm that will work will require, to deal with what you're saying, will require generically this modification. However, if it is asynchronous, that modification is not enough. You have to do another trick that I'm going to get momentarily to, and I haven't gotten yet, which is what I want to talk to you about. Okay. Now, okay, so we have seen here some failures, but now I wanna say what do we want to do? Okay, so or rather, before I tell you on the board what we want to do. Let me tell you just impressionistically why there is a problem. The problem of the culprit, as I write here, are this mixed state. As you try to transition in this sequence from, and I realized here I pictorially switched from the digit to something more poetic, sunset, sun, whatever. Yeah, so and here there's only 4 of them, okay? But as I try to transition from sunrise to sunset, I can get superposition of them. And the algorithm gets stuck there. Okay? And we need to somehow nudge it off or unstuck it and re-nudge the computation. So what is the trick that we use? And the trick is actually very simple. And it's really a bit like this logic that Luca was saying yesterday. To try to get a structure to your problem, right? Try to mimic a little bit in a brain where there is 2 different types of neurons, excitatory and inhibitory. And so what we're going to do here, we're going to have a double Hopfield network. This one here, okay? And I'm going to do this in 2 steps. And now here, I'm going to write the second Hopfield network that I'm going to call Y. Y of t is going to have the following dynamics. Still sine, but now of Kij, where Kij is defined asymmetrically here. So let me box the crucial equation here. Voila. Plus the usual white noise that we had also before. Let me put a label Y here. Okay, so this is not yet the trick. The trick will come by adding also something there. Okay, but please notice what I'm saying. I'm saying, imagine that you have this and this both together. This is a non-reciprocal component, and this one is still the vanilla Hopfield defined with a J. You see what I'm doing? This is not going to solve the problem, but it's going to do a little thing that inspired us to do another step after. And so, if you allow me, I want to show you what does this
mean. Trying to stay still, and Y is trying to move it.
Yes. Yes. And then this is the first step, and then you can anticipate. The other one is going to be to put the feedback in the one. But let me do one step at a time for those who are maybe less familiar with this thing. So I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to run the same computer simulation. You guys see what this model contains? This, and this one here. okay, coupled with each other. So this is what happens. Okay, this is just the same thing written but this is what I want to show you. So this is the bottom line. The mu patterns in the X neuron is mapped to the mu+1 patterns in the Y neurons. And that was my comment here, that this Kij acts as a projector or a shift. However, notice what happens. Please take a look at the time course. Notice that there is this shift, but then it's static. It stops there. Okay, you see, like as Daniel was into it, the X learns Z, and the Y learns the next one. Okay, because because Kij shifts from mu to mu+1. Okay, but it stays there. Okay, you don't have the whole sequence. It just does one step. So at this point, you could ask, what if I go back here and I reintroduce Y? So now Y can guide the dynamic of X. So let me put here lambda Y. I realized that this would be a J. Okay.
Those are eyes.
Those are ours.
Those are eyes, Vincenzo.
There's only a sum on the first part, right? The JX.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry. So I got it right, actually. Sorry. I. Good. Now, and this is the trick that Efe Dorok-Gochman was a postdoc here at the NITMB. I forgot if I mentioned all my collaborators at the beginning. If I didn't, their faces were there. But Efe is really instrumental in having invented that and in the analysis after. Okay, so let's see why this is a cool thing to do. First of all, now the Y knows already about the next step. It can talk to X. And now you can hope that this song and dance proceeds through the whole sequence. And I want to show you the time course once again. Oh, sorry. Even by eye, I hope you can see. Can you see it? It's even better if I grab it. You see, X and I. Can you see that? Then I move X until it becomes I. And you're going to see that I becomes U. I don't know if there's anybody else like other than me getting excited about doing this at ultra slow speed, but you see that is working, right? And as U goes to as Y goes to U, now X is preparing to become U, and the other one is preparing to become T. Okay. Now a less childish way to do that is, of course, instead of dragging this thing, is to look at the overlaps and see how they behave. Okay. Now, when you look at the overlaps, you can sort of see this sequential periodic behavior, and you can see that the Y neurons and the X neurons are offset from one another by that step. But there's one thing that emerges that really surprised us, which is the periodicity of the signal is not the 4 that is the pattern that we put. It's another one. It's 3. It's self-generated by the system. And to really show you in full, let me do something else, which is a bit what was already advertised for the vanilla upfield by Luca. So this is like now a phase diagram. You view your system and you ask, do I get, can I execute static retrieval? Can I execute a sequence retrieval or blackout, depending on the parameters I choose? For example, evidently, the number of patterns, and I notice here that there's a inconsistent usage of letters. So P now is the number of patterns, and N is the total number of neurons. That is one parameter. That is the parameter that if you stay with lambda equals 0, so you do lambda equals 0, you sort of recover vanilla off-field or 2 vanilla off-field with a shift. This axis is exactly what many of you have heard from Luca yesterday. And then, of course, there's a certain capacity about which the patterns are just too many for the static retrieval to work, and you go into blackout. But now we have another axis that we're opening up, which is parameterized by lambda. Okay, lambda is essentially the new ingredient that enable the what is written here as sequence retrieval or sequential learning, whatever you want to call it, what we call the computation, right? Now, there's one comment that I want to make, which is the reason why we call it the song and dance inertial. Okay, if I go here, because I mean, you look at this and say, geez, our one doesn't even come with this stuff, seems so artificial, and maybe it's true, but there is, in my mind at least, a way of thinking of it that is intuitive and is rooted in mechanics. So first of all, let me take a little bit of pieces out of this.
The phase diagram would look essentially the same for synchronous things if I just put the K in there, right?
Say again?
If I put Jij plus lambda K, right, Xj, would it look the same?
Where do you want to modify?
I just, for synchronous updates, right? I could just do the old Amit construction, which is what you guys started with.
Yeah.
It would look exactly the same, right? Almost. That's what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand if this phase diagram.
For synchronous update, there's absolutely no problem. But what I'm
But it would look the same, the phase diagram, as a function of the strength of, because I have to put two couplings in. I have to make the diameter. I'll ask you later.
Yeah. But the point is that this lambda, all this song and dance with the lambda, are not really useful for the synchronous case. All of this.
Because that's how you retrieve sequences, even in the synchronous case.
Mm,
It's in Amit's book. It's like chapter 6 of memory and brain function.
not so convinced. Not so convinced.
Oh.
So what I
Can I have a question?
Yeah.
Because this is very interesting model, but you may know the classical paper by Soplinsky and Kanter, the PIL
Yeah.
in 1986. Basically, they don't decouple into two populations, X and Y, but they only consider only one population of X, but they have the summation of both matrices, so the J and the K.
Yeah,
And then the relative strength between J and K is given by the parameter lambda, and they can have their own oscillation of sequence of pattern, and also the change in the capacity if you have the effect of the K term, and like also with the delay in the.
so that's a slightly. I'm familiar, of course, with that. And when I was alluding at the beginning that there are solutions to this issue by Soplinsky and Kanter. But again, I could pick up another beautiful quote instead, but from Hopfield, but from Soplinsky. There's a beautiful Physics Today that you probably know, in which he makes comment about whether constructing that construction that algorithmically works, which is a way of building, of putting by hand these delays, to what extent it's a realistic thing in a system where he would want the solution to emerge. Like he writes in his Physics Today, if you really had a brain, this is not how the brain works. Could we have this delay effectively emerging? What we're claiming is that this way of doing it doesn't put it by hand. It makes it emerge from the coupled dynamics of two things.
Yeah, but mathematically, if you have two coupled Langevin system and you integrate out one of the 2 degree of freedom, then the effective equation for the remaining variable would have this memory kernel with the delay term. So the delay can be either built-in, as you say, or you just enlarge the system.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. If you integrate out what is it, the y, you produce a time delay in the other. So on this I would agree. Yeah. Okay. So now what I would like to show is what happens. So first of all, sorry, what I wanted to say is one more comment. If I look at this system of equations, if you don't care about static retrieval at all, you can actually get rid of this term altogether. Okay. And so now, if you look at what we have done, okay, and please view this by analogy to an harmonic oscillator. Okay. So write down an harmonic oscillator in a symplectic form, in Hamilton equation. Okay. So you have which is an asymmetric coupling between the variable x and the variable p. So the variable x here, so this is dtx. So what I'm trying to say is that the y neurons play the role of momentum, and the x neuron played the role of the coordinate. So if, and maybe I should just say, lambda is something like 1 over the mass. Okay, so we're putting an inertia, which is your intuition that inertia is a memory, essentially. And so when we now have so this is p equal minus kx, okay, p dot equal minus kx, and this is x dot equal p, okay? So essentially this lambda is putting an inertial structure in the system that will facilitate, will nudge it. And another idea that perhaps is connected is that there's an algorithm that probably is ultra famous of putting momentum to go down stochastic gradient descent. This is perhaps a somewhat similar logic, but you're not trying to go to the bottom of potential, but to some sort of limit cycle or dynamical steady state through which you're embedding this sequence of things. And now the part that I thought was quite neat is that, or at least we didn't expect it, is if you look at okay, so first of all, the various stages can be defined from the overlap. This is the blackout phase. This is the static retrieval one. That's why it's static retrieval, because you retrieve a finite overlap and you stay there. But in the dynamical one, where you're changing between the different patterns, of course, there is a periodic structure. But please notice the periodicity of this signal is, you see, this point corresponds to the sun, whatever it's called, to this state. This corresponds to this state, but the moon is here. And in between, let's say at 2, there is a mixed state. But the algorithm, as you saw, is able to go past the mixed state and go to the next. But this periodicity that I try to highlight here is 3. And the value 3 is neither the 4 that we put by hand, we put by hand. Is a number that is generated by the algorithm itself, okay, by the many body dynamics of the system. And that's something that you have to deal with a little bit. And one way to deal with this, and I think that you can deal at a different level of algebraic complexity, if you want to do a mathematical analysis of this model using dynamical mean field theory, as we've seen in all the previous talks, first of all, it works. Let me advertise. And what you can do, if you go on the phase diagram, you can travel, and here is you trigger or you increase the memory load. Okay, and if you track what happens to the order parameter as that happens, you will see a very sharp transition. You may even be tempted to call it phase transition, reminiscent perhaps of what physicists sometimes call superheating, because in between dynamical retrieval and blackout, there is a coexistence region. Now, this language, I put it in bracket because I don't like it very much, because this is really language of, maybe an equilibrium manifestation of this phenomena, which is very sharp as well. Here, the analysis cannot be done in terms of, energy landscape, etc. However, you can do 2 things. The first one that you can do, which is the cheaper, is you take the answer. You know that the answer from the computer is that you generated this internal frequency, if you like, and you rewrite the equation of the MFT in this sort of Floquet form, okay, where this omega is put by hand. This is possible and a little bit cheaper, but it's also a little bit cheating because it's not a self-consistent theory of the phenomena. The analysis should generate also the periodicity by itself if you do it properly. And as of a couple of weeks, we've been able to do it also self-consistently. And now we have even a calculation that is detailed in that paper, where the DMFT analysis is done without assuming that you put by hand the periodicity at the price of algebraic complexity.
And there is one period that is emerging.
Yes, for this version of the algorithm.
It's an integer. It's an integer
Yeah,
period.
it's an
It's sort of mode locking, because in general, there's no particular reason why it had to be an integer, but it
No.
sort of mode locks to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
simple integer. And that presumably helps with this whole synchrony issue.
Yeah,
So
we think so.
synchronizing itself.
I cannot say that I have an intuitive understanding of it yet.
Once it is a period, a sort of noisy period, and then
The thing I don't have an intuitive understanding of is how that tree is generated. Right? How this frequency that is now put by hand emerges.
But is it definitely 3 rather than 3.1?
Yes, it is true. It is true. I mean, you saw the data. I mean,
Right. So it's a question of what sort of locks it to an integer.
yeah.
I think you can break it by just, if you use the normal Hopf field and you put lambda i's in front of that. The important point is that the basins are all the same size. So you can put a W mu, in your Jij,
Yeah,
and you'll see you can
you can.
you can change it. You can get a whole spectrum of these.
Maybe that would be worthwhile. Now, of course, whenever we talk about all of these things, if we ever get to the part where we try to implement things, every little trick that you want to add in an equation is one more thing that you will have to engineer in a physical platform. So we're trying to go for the most economical, especially if you really want to do with natural systems. Okay, that may not be a constraint for everybody, but now one thing that we also tried, and I think that maybe I should speak for myself and not for my collaborators who are quite sophisticated, but maybe we're not quite good enough in mathematics to do this properly. So let me just tell you, one thing that you could ask also is that, okay, so you've done this calculation, you more or less recast it in the language that physicists like about phase transition, with a cautionary remark about this phase transition not being analyzable in terms of change of landscape. But there should be a way of analyzing it also in terms of dynamical system theory. In fact, that language to some extent is more natural because the dynamics is the only thing that exists in this problem. And the poor man version that we've done is that we found a way of embed. This is the difficulty that we don't know how to tackle directly. A large number of neurons, discrete data, into a two-dimensional continuous time dynamical system. So we have two essentially principal components. Once we do this projection in a controlled manner that preserves the order of the patterns, then all of a sudden we can take whatever we know about bifurcation theory in a poor man fashion. And what we discovered is that if I look at what's going on here through the lenses of this embedded low-dimensional space, which is, of course, a reduction of the information that exists, the transition from blackout to coexistence, so the blackout phase is a stable fixed point. This stable fixed point goes unstable right here, whatever this number is. So here there are unstable limit cycles. And then there is, again, here, a saddle node that leads to a stable limit cycle, which is the dynamical retrieval. These facts are true, but they're true in this low-dimensional embedding. Could be nice if somebody mathematically could analyze it directly in the high-dimensional space. Maybe I see Pankaj laughing.
I promise you, I just want to show you, I made my talk for tomorrow already. All right.
Okay. Well, so we were a bit less. We didn't manage to do that. Okay, but I wanted to highlight it as an interesting thing to try. What I want to say then, it's so Effe was in Zurich, and he was playing table tennis with somebody. And I guess being Effe thought it was a good idea during a table tennis match to describe this to the other guy. And but the other guy actually was working in a neuromorphic computing lab, and told him, actually, this thing that you're doing maybe is not as useless as you think. And why don't you come and give a talk to our boss? And the boss is, of course, our co-author Giacomo Indiveri, who directs the Neuroinformatic Institute in Zurich. And long story short, with some help from Dmitry Zendrikov, Effe went there, and in fact, he's still there improving some of these things, and took some neuromorphic hardware that Giacomo Indiveri's group has been developing over the years, and essentially tried to implement this scheme in there. Now, when we were writing the papers, and we were writing with Effe the word implement, I realized that I didn't quite like it. Because to me, an implementation, which is a bit different from an experiment, is an exercise in which there's such a close match between what you're doing and what you're calculating that you can almost guess what the answer is going to be. Now, for a while, since we saw a bunch of things that we're predicting coming up, we deluded ourselves. But in retrospect, there's one thing that is actually quite different between what we calculate and this. The neuromorphic hardware, even without going into the details, is made with electrical signals. These are circuits. So these are analog signals. None of the calculations that we do are done for analog signals. You know, to some people, this may seem like a small difference. To me, it's not. And it is, most crucial, it's not for the physical system in question. And I'm going to tell you a couple of things.
If I replace X and Y by continuous variables in some well and replace this sign by some.
But that's not the calculations we did.
Okay, but I mean, if I.
That's not the calculations we did, and quite frankly, I cannot even advertise that we will be able to reproduce those calculations in the MFT that we've done if you did that substitution. If one did that, then you can claim it.
Calculations. The question is, does the sort of results change?
It does, and I'm going to tell you, for example, in some ways it does. Not completely. Your intuition that there is a robustness to what we've done is correct. But there's something that happens in the analog system that we cannot get. Is more expressive to some extent. And that's why I expect that physical system that naturally works with analog signals may be able to do what we're calculated even more easily. But let me first show you what's going on here. This is going to be a movie too. And please, so imagine this is Efe's computer. And now we're downgraded ourselves to this pathetic sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not the most visually impressive. What you're going to see here is this is Efe can control lambda in the circuit, in the neuromorphic chip. And I'm going to first put a finite lambda, where we know this thing should work. And I don't know if you can see, I mean, I'm excited about this thing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, you're going to see the cursor there. Efe lowers it, lambda, towards 0. Please go and check out what's happening here. So when we send lambda to 0, of course, this stops happening. Okay. But there was one thing that was quite interesting that was happening in these systems that we cannot get in our calculation. You remember I said that in the Hopfield model, if we want to do the thing that you were asking about, namely that I pull out, I first choose a neuron, and then the one that I choose after is not meant to be that one, which builds correlations between steps. I cannot do it with normal Hopfield. I have to do that nonlinear version that is the modern Hopfield, which incidentally, we cannot calculate the nonlinear one. We can only calculate the actual Hopfield. Because of structural reasons of the existing hardware, Efe could implement here only the vanilla Hopfield, not the modern Hopfield. Yet, even when he was doing the update in a way that was building correlation, this algorithm still works. Okay? And this is because it's an analog platform. So it's not an exact mirror of the other one. And to my eyes, this is an interesting way to see the difference between the two. I should also say that for the neuroscientists in the audience, that this is not a brain, evidently. It's just, but it's called neuromorphic, not without a reason. And so the architecture is a bunch of little knobs that you can also tweak that we don't quite have. For example, one of them is the so-called refractory period that mimics a bit the similar things in neurons. If you play with the refractory period and you send the refractory period to 0, then you can no longer do this trick to get this to work as if it was a modern Hopfield. So there is an extra knob in here that comes from the analog structure of the spiking neural networks that is beyond what we calculated. But what we calculated does happen. It just happens a bit better than what we expected to do, because in my opinion, it's an analog platform. Okay? So now one question that you can do is that now that you built this platform, this chip, can you actually do some algorithm on it? Right? Can you run some algorithm? And so Efe idea was, let's try to denoise movies. Okay? So here first I want to explain this figure, if you don't mind, before I even... So first let me tell you what we're going to try to do. we're going to try to denoise movies that the algorithm never sees. The movies will still be the stupid sequence of digits. But the crucial point is that we don't want the algorithm to see those movies in the denoised form. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to use built on development that I cited in the previous slides by Protov and others on this modern off. And so remember that this F that I was describing here, right? The nonlinearity that you can put in the modern off field. I'm going to take this F to be a polynomial whose degree is n. And what you see here on this axis is n, even if it's written as n, okay? And what there is here is the memory load, okay? And what we're going to do to trigger this, I would like to say, poor man instantiation of a memorization to generalization transition is to load the network beyond capacity, okay? So if you load it below capacity, it just does retrieval or memorization. But if you load it above capacity, then it can denoise movies like the sequences, even if he has never seen the denoised version. And let me just play a version of that, as usual on this thing here. And you can see what I mean. These are the denoised sequences. I mean, it's not the most interesting movie that the world has seen, but the point is that to our eyes, it reproduces a poor man instantiation of a memorization.
Aren't you just learning all 100 projectors? Isn't that where the 100 comes from? So there's 10 categories, right?
What did you say, 100? What's 100?
How many of these letters do you have?
In this case, I think there's maybe 9-ish.
9-ish, so you're 81, right? You need to learn 81 projectors. So if you load it up, you load up all 81 projectors, right? I think that's probably roughly, and then you randomly sample, so it's
that's it.
So I don't think it's quite the same thing as the memorization generalization, because what should really happen is you memorize, you get really bad, and then you generalize.
Yeah,
I would say it's a slightly different phenomenon. Here it's more like memorizing all the.
This is something that we can check, though. I mean, definitely not. Definitely, this is not an example of content addressable memory.
I would say it's not even memorization generalization the way people talk about it in transformers.
Well, we were more thinking in the way people think in diffusion models, for example.
No, I wouldn't say it's.
But we can discuss that. I mean, we can do that test that you're.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple numerical test.
Now, I don't know how I'm doing with time. If I'm done, I'm done. I'm done. Okay, but then let me tell you what and I think it's probably, as my PhD advisor used to say, it's better to uncover a little bit. Hopefully we did, then, or at least have fun, than to cover too much. And but let me tell you one question that one could ask, and then I leave it to you guys to see whether you find it even interesting. This question is not very original because it's contained in the initial title of the paper of Hopfield from 1982. I don't know to what extent it's been done, though. So neural networks and physical systems with emergent collective abilities. And first of all, if you fast forward to 2020 something, you can read review papers, one of them by Pankacci, where Hopfield networks are used as a lens to analyze, maybe not with all the details, biological phenomena that have nothing to do with neuroscience. Similarly, you could imagine implementing this thing in platforms that are physical. Okay, and now from a perspective of sequences and computers, programs, the thing that one has to understand is exactly how do we get this Jij not to be symmetric? Because from a perspective of physics, those dynamics are dynamics that do not come from an energy minimization. So a normal magnet that is a closed system will not naturally do that. You probably have to pump it. You have to do something like you shine a laser and you let it loose. But in robotics and biological system, this is quite possible because many of the interactions are not fundamental interactions that are constructed to preserve, satisfy Newton's third law or energy conservation. They're always mediated by some field. It could be a physical field, particle immersed in fluids, could be biological cells talking to each other via chemical signals that are not symmetric. It could be robotic structure. Actually, once you start thinking,
Still the second law.
Second law, F equal ma, that's what you're referring to. Second law of thermodynamics. Okay, that too. I know that one too. But please notice that when we say that we are not conserving energy, we don't mean that we're not conserving energy. We mean you want to do an effective theory of a system, of an open system, in which you only look at a part and the rest pumps energy and does whatever you want. That effective theory is allowed to break whatever you want, but you can still do the accountancy of what happens very well. And so the next 20 slides of this talk, if you want to see, you can ask me, are about how to do this in distributed robotics, how to do this with biological systems like tissues, and how to do that in soft condensed matter systems of particles moving in fluids. And it's a bit of a different type of game, but it's not unrelated to the original dream of Hoffield, and that dream continues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions?
I think that's maybe one that was already.
So in the previous slide, you were showing the denoising algorithm, but before you said that your model has an intrinsic variability speed. So I was wondering whether to get a good denoising, you need to fine-tune the movie.
No, we didn't. No, we didn't. It's not There's not a commensurate period. No, that we checked. Yeah, it's robust.
So cool, as always. The new expressivity that you hint is found in the set of analog implementation. Could you give a little bit more of a speculation about, like, it could be, as Daniel was saying, like partly to do with the transformation of the sign being relaxed, or it could be the sort of continuous nature of the signal inside the sign.
Okay, I'll give you my 2 cents. And I'm going to quote my colleague Sid Nagel once said, "I don't know what I think, I know what I see." And we don't have a theory that describes that, but what I did see is what happens when I tune the refractory period. Okay, and that goes back a bit to your comments. Like, what we're trying to do here implicitly is build the delays that are then the memory, the inertia, whatever other ways you do it. You can choose which one is easier to implement in the context you care. And in the refractory period of the neurons is another way to do that. And that's why, in my opinion, when FA tunes the refractory period to go to 0, all this miracle disappears, and the spiking neural net does just as bad as our Hopfield. Maybe this can be understood in the term you say, but that's my gut feeling at the moment. Then.
This model seems to be able to capture like a single time scale in your data, right? Could you?
Or more than, I don't know if capture is the word, but it emerges, if you're alluding to that omega, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk something about how this model would need to be changed if there are multiple time scales in the data?
Yeah, I think that when you go close to the transition, you can generate others. We're starting seeing signatures of that. In that case, you don't even have to change the model. You just have to change the region of phase diagram you're looking for. But I don't have, as I was acknowledging explicitly, I don't have a good understanding of the onset of that emergent timescale at the moment. And as I said, until a couple of weeks ago, even leave it alone the intuition, even the calculations that we were doing, we were putting it by hand. Now there is a self-consistent calculation. So one could say, if you understand that calculation, you should be able to boil it down to me with an intuitive explanation. And maybe what I'm saying is that I don't yet. Well, I'm hoping that at some point we will. It would be a good practice for your own papers.
So in terms of biological plausibility, it's not very plausible that each X neuron has its own private Y neurons that's coupled to it, right? But it is plausible that individual neurons have their own oscillatory dynamics kind of embedded in them. So I'm wondering if you've tried anything along those lines.
Not yet.
That would be
not yet. But one of the things that I'm kind of interested at the moment, I mean, we landed on this model by a mixture of simplicity and what we could analyze also because we were interested in being able to perform those calculations as well. my dream would be now to revisit problems of natural system, but not necessarily only neuroscience, with variants, more realistic, where some of this goes on and that we can understand. But we haven't really taken that step.
Another idea would be just the nonlinearly coupled damped harmonic oscillators. Is that sufficient to get?
So one thing I can tell you is that the damped harmonic oscillator, do you remember all that song and dance that I was saying about this transition being a special type of bifurcation that cannot be understood in terms of an energy landscape, but there's something in the, I didn't maybe say all of these things, in the Jacobian or the dynamics that happens. It's called an exceptional point, which is the point where two eigenvectors coalesce. And probably the simplest example that I know of that, it's a damped harmonic oscillator, even linear. And at a critical damping, if you write down as Hamilton equation, that's exactly what happens. So I'm wondering whether maybe your intuition, in the same way, of course, this is not quite an harmonic oscillator either, but maybe baking that in with two neural network degrees of freedom that emulate that is in a sense, but yeah, again, we haven't really done that. What I described to you is pretty much the only thing we've done, and it's a very recent thing, so we haven't had the time to explore more.
Is there a natural generalization to, if you wanted to learn not a discrete sequence but a continuous function of time?
Not that I can see immediately. But
presumably you can just make the time step small.
Yeah, I mean that of course we can do, but and given that now one thing that to play to Aditya's comment, this is certainly not what I demonstrated to you, because I mean you might have astutely noticed that even in this guy seems to do things a little bit better. Notice that 1, 2, 3, 4. The guys occupy different. So we've gone out of our way to could be a good way to put it, a technical way to put it. So if you want to do what you're saying, and you should start by get the one in the transition to, and that's a bit of a. But on a computer it works. We did less cheating and maybe variants of what we've done, but I cannot claim that we have found a way to do that yet. These are all interesting questions when you go towards also real phenomena. But the first question that I have to understand myself is how to, and there's a postdoc, Rebecca Rousseau, that's working on this thing, is how do you really define asynchrony in those contexts? It's a bit less obvious than when you have discrete updates. Yeah.
Can you speculate on what can happen if instead of just adding one-step correlations, you add 2 time-step correlations in the same case, like both of them in the same time?
Both of them. I don't know.
You think it's going to pick one of the next state is going to?
You want to have both simultaneously, or
definition of the same case?
Yeah, so we didn't do it because we wanted to run through the sequence. Mm-hmm. If you want to skip one and you have +2, I would imagine it will continue to work. If you do a combination of both, though.
Yeah, so what happened? We played.
I don't know that.
Development models, we have
done
terms like that. Yeah. And what happens is that whichever one you have, it depends on not quite this variant, but if you do the Cantor-Zampolinski equivalent of this variant, whichever one you overlap with more, there's regimes, you go to that one. But it gets really bad in the Hopfield things, because then the same problem he's trying to cheat on there becomes really bad.
Yeah.
We have a series of papers where we do this, but it's all hidden in developmental biology literature.
Why in developmental biology, if I may ask you? Maybe this is more a discussion.
We always think about cell states as the attractors.
I see.
And then we think about transitions between cell fates as exactly these kind of things. And the whole idea is developmental signals turn up your lambda. Exactly.
If I sort of the challenge, in some sense you want a dynamical system, which is relatively low dimensional. I mean, here basically 2. And then you want to go through a series of almost fixed points that have many fast directions that you come in, or a few fast directions and one sort of slow one you go through.
I don't know if they're fixed point or if it's just
There's shallow valleys, and then you go, and then there's another shallow valley, and you keep going around. I mean, that's in some sense it's a target of trying to get a series of almost fixed points. So you go slow, fast, through a given sequence.
So the only thing I have to comment on that is that you have this beautiful picture in your mind about slopes. So it's clear that you have still a landscape.
No, I don't have a landscape. I mean, if it's only fixed points, and a cycle, I can think of it in.
So I don't know if it's a fixed point or just some sort of limit cycle.
No,
that you cycle through
where you're going slowly, fast, slow,
potentially,
right? To get a sequence like that. Yeah.
Potentially.
This is what we're going to do with the army.
Okay. But
arbitrary mathematical system.
But
Okay, so thank you.